Although somewhat vague and hard to pinpoint, neoliberal ideology seeps in and pervades just about every facet of our life and our society at large, including our education system, our media, our think tanks, our corporate and financial institutions, our state institutions, even our international institutions like the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF. Neoliberalism is political, it's economic, it's a system of social relations and a set of values. And what neoliberalism values are strong private property rights, free trade, and of course, free markets. In fact, free market exchange is seen as a value or an ethic in itself. Neoliberal doctrine says that contractual relations in the marketplace will encourage greater social well-being, and so therefore works to bring all parts of life into the market and seeks to commodify everything and everyone. Personal values and relationships can't help but be influenced by this. I mean, not only are we taught to brand ourselves as early as possible in order to make ourselves more attractive and marketable to prospective colleges and employers, but we've managed to reduce our relationships to market transactions as well. You know, I do something for you, you do something for me. I buy you dinner, you give me sex, that type of thing. Individualism and personal responsibility are the mantras that are constantly shoved down our throats, yet collective corporate interests absolutely dominate this world. We speak of equality of opportunity, yet neoliberalism depends on and in fact creates staggering inequality, and at its core serves to concentrate mass amounts of wealth and power in the hands of a few. It does this through privatization, deregulation, austerity, like cuts to public spending and tax cuts for the wealthy, and neo-mercantilism masked as free trade. So this video is going to be part one in a two-part series. This part one is going to mainly discuss the core tenets and the history of neoliberalism, and part two is going to discuss the many contradictions inherent in neoliberal theory itself, and also the contradictions that have emerged between the theory and the actual implementation of neoliberal principles. Also, I wanted to shout out a Privileged Vegans video on neoliberalism. It's a really great breakdown of the way neoliberalism has literally brainwashed us into believing that whatever is good for the market is good for the society. I'll leave the link in the description below. You should definitely check it out. Really good video. The origins of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has its roots in classical liberalism and the political economic theories laid out by Adam Smith in his groundbreaking text, The Wealth of Nations. Smith argues that human beings are naturally selfish and self-serving, and that organizing society around such intrinsic characteristics will benefit all involved. Competition is the mechanism which keeps self-interested folks in check, and so what we have is a system where self-interest therefore becomes the motivator of economic activity, competition the regulator, and together they form the invisible hand, which magically, creates the perfect environment for efficient resource allocation, right? That's the theory anyways. Neoliberalism takes this idea, puts it on steroids, and then distorts it and perverts it, and what we're left with is this really corrupt and warped system based not on individual self-interest, but on corporate interest. And the effects have just honestly been nothing short of disastrous. The organization and implementation of neoliberalism was basically a reaction to the embedded liberalism imposed after the Depression and World War II. Embedded liberalism was the system of embedding market forces into a structure where they could then be regulated by the state. This meant a huge expansion of the welfare state, lots of social safety nets, public services, state-led planning, and nationalization of major industries of the economy, like iron, steel, even automobiles. This remained the system until the 1970s when stagflation took hold. Stagflation basically means high inflation, high unemployment, and stagnating economic growth. And the effects reverberated throughout the world. There are conflicting theories as to what caused stagflation, but it certainly did not help that in 1973, the OPEC countries placed an oil embargo on anyone thought to have been supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. This included Canada, Japan, the UK, the Netherlands, and the United States. However, after the US threatened military invasion in Saudi Arabia, the OPEC countries agreed to recycle their excess petrodollars through New York investment banks. The banks then used this money for loans to foreign governments and to organize bribes and coups against democratically elected governments in foreign countries. This happened in Nicaragua, Iran, Chile, etc. Why am I talking about this? Well, this money helped to install the first test case for neoliberalism. During the 1970s, the United States participated in extensive covert activity in Chile in order to prevent and then subsequently sabotage a Salvador Allende presidency. Fearing a Marxist government arising, and basically just to protect US investments, the CIA planned out multiple plots to take down Allende, including bribing of high-ranking officials, spreading propaganda, and ultimately assisting in the military coup that overthrew Allende and brought Augusto Pinochet to power. Pinochet dismantled Congress, banned all leftist political parties, installed a military dictatorship, and then used the Chicago Boys to install a neoliberal regime. To understand the significance of this, we have to go back to 1956. The United States, as part of their plan to counter the spread of Soviet ideology to Latin America, invited 25 Chilean students to come to the University of Chicago to learn about monetarism. Monetarism is the theory that controlling the money supply is the best way to stabilize an economy, and it's one of the core tenets of neoliberalism. They studied under Milton Friedman, who, along with Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, very much spearheaded the neoliberal school of thought, the Mont Pelerin Society, and the subsequent spread of neoliberal ideology. These students, known as the Chicago Boys, then came home to work for various South American governments, including, surprise, surprise, the military dictatorship of Chile under Pinochet, where they basically engineered the complete neoliberalization of the economy. This meant privatizing dozens of state enterprises, deregulating financial and economic activity, and removing barriers to foreign imports, all of which was extremely beneficial to US investments, by the way. This experiment in Chile provided the first test case of neoliberalism in practice and would serve as the blueprint for Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s. Infiltrating our institutions. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the Mont Pelerin Society garnered funding from various wealthy individuals and corporations, and neoliberal ideology slowly began to infiltrate our various institutions, including our schools, our universities, our courts, media, all that. Think tanks and institutions were created specifically for conducting research and for forming arguments that favored neoliberal policy. They remained largely under the radar until the 1970s, when corporations then band together to fight off consumer protection legislation, workers' rights laws, and regulatory constraints, and sought to reform tax laws and antitrust legislation. They buddied up to the Republican Party, formed political action committees, and essentially bought their way into political favor. Neoliberal advocates did a really great job appealing to people's frustrations and their insecurities by centering their message on freedom and liberty. Maxine made a really great video on the myth of freedom under capitalism you should definitely check out, but basically the message is this: only a society built on free market principles and ownership of private property deserves to be called free. Planning, regulation, and control are seen as a tax on this freedom and therefore deserve to be abolished. And that's pretty much what happened. With the appointment of Reagan in the US and Thatcher in the UK in the early 80s, we basically saw a complete dismantling of the social safety nets put into place during the years of embedded liberalism. We saw mass deregulation in finance and industry take place and huge tax cuts for the wealthy. There was pretty much an all-out assault on workers' rights, epitomized by Reagan's showdown with the air traffic controllers organization PATCO in 1981, followed by Thatcher's fight against the miners' strike in 1984. Trade unions were broken up and unemployment soared. Everything became privatized. We're talking transportation, health, education, water, even prisons. I mean, the prison industrial complex in the United States has become a billion-dollar industry. profit maximization through inmate retention. That does not sound like freedom to me, but I suppose that depends on what your definition of freedom is. As George Monbiot writes, freedom from trade unions and collective bargaining means the freedom to suppress wages. Freedom from regulation means the freedom to poison rivers, endanger workers, charge iniquitous rates of interest, and design exotic financial instruments. Freedom from tax means freedom from the distribution of wealth that lifts people out of poverty. Freedom doesn't exist except for the people that can afford it. And honestly, that number is dwindling as the rich get richer and the gap between the richest and the poorest continues to widen. In Russia, the privatization of state assets like steel mills and oil fields led to the concentrated wealth and power of the 7 oligarchs. Privatization of land in China led to an elite capitalist class formation at the expense of nearly 180 million peasants forced from their homes. And Carlos Slim became the richest man alive through monopolization of Mexico's telecommunications company Telmex after the government privatized that. Neoliberalism solidified. During the 1990s, neoliberalism solidified its position as the Democrats in the United States and Labour in the UK adopted neoliberal policies. Bill Clinton basically betrayed his traditional constituency. He bought into the neoliberal agenda and became the face of welfare reform. He created the disastrous 3 Strikes crime bill and repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, all of which served to deepen social and economic inequality. As David Harvey puts it, social policy was in effect put in the care of Wall Street bondholders. And I just want to point out too that the justification for a lot of these policies, like the deregulation of finance, has been to create wealth at the top, which, will trickle down to the bottom. But not only does trickle down not work, wealth isn't actually even being created. As David Harvey points out in A Brief History of Neoliberalism, the main achievement of neoliberalism has been to redistribute rather than to generate wealth and income, and redistribute upwards through what he refers to as something called accumulation by dispossession. This has happened through the commodification and the privatization of land and the violent removal of peasants, as I discussed earlier. This has happened through debt peonage and the credit system. Instead of increasing wages or, getting rid of wage labor altogether, we've created a system of buy now, pay later, which essentially enslaves people and holds them hostage to their future labor. We also have an international finance system that only protects the interests of the imperial creditor nations. This was demonstrated in 1982 with the Latin American debt crisis. After Fed Chairman Paul Volcker essentially increased interest rates overnight, Mexico defaulted on its loans to the US, setting off a rippling effect across Latin America. Reagan, with the help of the IMF, eventually agreed to roll over the debt, but only if Mexico agreed to structural adjustment, which, if you've seen my video on that, you know how absolutely disastrous structural adjustment has been. Structural adjustment basically calls for the same shitty policies we just discussed that don't work. Austerity, privatization, deregulation, but instead of domestic inequality, we have international inequality, where the developed Western countries get rich at the expense of the developing countries. And then we call the exchange between the two free trade. No, I'm going to discuss this more in my next video, but no, this is not free trade. This is neo-mercantilism because only one country is benefiting: finance. Neoliberalization has meant the financialization of everything. Deregulation, the opening up of borders to freer flows of capital, increased investment in stocks, property, and other assets, all created a shift in which the financial sector became more powerful than the production and services sector underlying it. Big corporations, once focused solely on production, began to become more financial in their composition. And so a manufacturing company could now report losses in production offset by gains from financial operations. Investment and speculation of epic proportions took place. New markets were created based on futures trading, derivatives, and securitization. All of this leading to riskier and riskier business practices, the too big to fail banking system, Neoliberalism, and inevitably the 2008 financial crisis. And if we've learned anything from the 2008 crisis, it's that those in power would rather watch the system collapse than give up any of their power or wealth. What's more is that we've actually seen the people responsible for the crisis, in this case the financial institutions, not only walk away unscathed and legally untouched, but they've actually gone on to double their bonuses and reap great benefits from the breakdown of smaller businesses and individuals. Not much has changed since 2008, and it's only a matter of time before another collapse happens. The role of the state. When George Bush invaded Iraq, he claimed to be bringing freedom and democracy to the people. But what he really envisioned was what David Harvey calls the neoliberal state. A state that imagines freedom, but freedom for private corporations, financial institutions, etc. Not freedom for the people actually affected by such decisions. The US and the UK led a brutal assault against the Iraqi people, claiming weapons of mass destruction as their justification, which so was not ever true. I mean, they stripped its people of their homes, their livelihoods, their political affiliation, all to ensure the open flow of Iraqi oil to British and US economies. And so what we see time and time again is a neoliberal ideology that espouses limited to no government, but in practice, we see exceptions being made and in fact encouraged, which advocates state intervention as long as it serves the interest of capital. What we see is that the role of the neoliberal state is really to ensure a good business climate by any means necessary, to suppress democracy, to protect corporate interests, to use force, even violence, and all coercive means necessary to defend the propertied class and suppress opposition. So yeah, neoliberalism is pretty much the worst thing ever. And more people are catching on and fighting back. We saw this with the popularity of Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, the anti-establishment rebellion of Brexit, and even the totally misguided election of Donald Trump. Movements of all kinds have sprung up over the years, including Occupy Wall Street, the ongoing Zapatistas movement, the landless peasant movement in Brazil, and the factory occupations in Argentina, and so many more. People are getting woke, and they're not willing to remain silent anymore, and that is what we need. So next time I'm going to discuss the many contradictions inherent in neoliberalism. So stay tuned for that, and if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. I'd love to hear your comments, and yeah, share and subscribe. So thanks so much for watching, guys.